As the West becomes more and more settled during the period of the Gilded Age, the military and U.S. government tried to figure out what they were going to do with the Native American tribes living in the West. They had determined that the best solution was to try to convince the tribes to take up life on out-of-the-way, isolated reservations. And many of the tribes did that basically because they were starving. A lot of the buffalo are going away because so many have been killed to feed the men building the Transcontinental Railroad, and that had been a primary source of food for the tribes. And so starvation will make many of the tribes decide that they need to go on the reservations, but there will be others who will fight against that. One of the last leaders and great warriors who really stood up against that concept was a man named Geronimo. He lived from 1829 to 1909. He was a chief of the Chiricahua Apaches. In 1850, Mexican settlers ambushed and killed his wife and children in their village, after which Geronimo basically devoted his life to ruthlessly raiding along the borderlands, and he lived in the Arizona-New Mexico territory areas. In 1875, U.S. authorities branded Geronimo a troublemaker because he opposed military plans to concentrate all the Apaches at the desolate San Carlos Reservation in eastern Arizona. Geronimo fled with a band of followers into Mexico, but was soon arrested and returned to the reservation. But he really wasn't contained there. He would use it as kind of a base. He would stay there long enough to get supplies and food, and then he would escape from the reservation and go back to raiding. And so he just basically went back and forth pretty much for the remainder of the decade. In the 1880s, that because of starvation, because of more and more troops coming into that area, he is finally forced to do something different, and he decides that he just can't keep doing that, and he's going to have to, he's going to have to surrender. In 1886, Geronimo and some 450 other Apaches were sent to Florida for confinement in Fort Marion and Pickens. In 1894, the Apaches were removed to Fort Sill Indian Territory, and Geronimo became a rancher, and he actually dies there, and he is buried there. You can go and see his grave today. In 1886, when Geronimo surrendered, 243,000 Native Americans were confined to 187 reservations. With Geronimo's last resistance extinguished, the Indian Wars were practically at an end, but not quite. Wovoka was a member of the Paiute tribe living in western Nevada. By the 1880s, Wovoka, whose English name was Jack Wilson, began preaching to the reservation Indians about what came to be known as the ghost dance religion. He foretold a new world in which only Indians dwelled. Generations of slain warriors would come back to life, and the buffalo would again be plentiful. To make it happen more quickly, Wovoka counseled all Indians must dance the ghost dance and lead righteous lives, and he would have them sew vests that he would pray over, and he said that those vests would now be impenetrable to bullets. And he really convinced a lot of the Native Americans that if they did what he said, that everything would basically return to the way it had been decades before, that they would essentially have their life back. And while that sounds kind of strange to us today, these people had lost everything, and they really just wanted to hold on to this possibility, this hope that the buffalo would come back, they would be free to roam and do as they once had, and that life would return to the way it once was. And you can't help but really feel their pain and their desire to have that freedom again. The ghost dance spread throughout the West. Soon, many Western reservations were alive with what many observers regarded as frenzied dancing. Leaders among the Teton Sioux at Pine Ridge, South Dakota, called for armed rebellion. The reservation agent there, Daniel Royer, frantically telegraphed Washington, D.C. in November 1890 for help, but the arrival of troops under Nelson Miles only seemed to make the situation worse. As a precaution, Indian reservation police were sent on December 15, 1890, to arrest Sitting Bull, who was living at Standing Rock Reservation and who had become an advocate for the ghost dance. A scuffle broke out and Sitting Bull was killed. In the meantime, another chief, Bigfoot of the Minneconjou Sioux, was making his way to Pine Ridge with his people. They were among the most enthusiastic believers in the ghost dance ceremony. Bigfoot decided to lead his people to Pine Ridge, hoping for peace. Increasingly ill with pneumonia, he had no intention of fighting, but nobody bothered to ask that question, why he was coming. General Miles dispatched the 7th Cavalry to intercept Bigfoot and his followers. The troops caught up with him on December 28, 1890, at a place called Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The next morning, the soldiers set up several large Hotchkiss guns, an early version of a machine gun, on a hill overlooking the camp and began confiscating the Indians' weapons. When a gun accidentally went off, they opened fire, and within a few minutes, some 370 Sioux lay dead, many of them cut down by the Hotchkiss guns. The soldiers even pursued fleeing women and children, shooting some as far as 2 miles from the site of the original fight. Bigfoot was among the first killed. His frozen corpse lay untouched for 3 days until it was unceremoniously dumped into a mass grave. 400 years of Indian warfare had finally come to an end. Well-intentioned reformers sought to Americanize the Indians by dealing with them as individuals rather than as tribes. The culmination of reform efforts came in the Dawes Act of 1887, which was actually passed before the Battle of Wounded Knee. Sponsored by Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, the act proposed to introduce the Indians to individual land ownership and agriculture. The Dawes Act permitted the president to divide the lands of any tribe and grant 160 acres to each head of family and lesser amounts to others. The government would hold it in trust for 25 years, after which the owner won full title and became a citizen. In 1901, citizenship was extended to the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma, the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole, and in 1924 to all Indians. Under the Burke Act of 1906, Indians who took up life apart from their tribes could become citizens immediately, even before the 1924 deadline. During the 1870s and 1880s, a migration from farms to urban factories began to occur. The workforce became increasingly composed of women and children. Most of the women were young, single, and between the ages of 18 and 24. By 1910, 25% of all American children were employed full-time in the nation's factories, and industrialization is really growing, and we're becoming where we need more and more unskilled labor as opposed to skilled labor. And so you're going to have some conflicts develop there. You're also going to begin to have a movement to reduce the workday to 10 hours, and in a few cities such as Chicago, there was agitation for what we consider to be standard 8 hours a day. A few businessmen and managers agreed with those reforms, but most didn't. And so you're going to really begin to see in the 1880s and 1890s a lot of conflicts between labor and management. The Knights of Labor was founded in 1869. It was the first significant national labor organization, and it was open to any worker, unskilled, skilled, men and women, except for lawyers, bankers, gamblers, and liquor dealers. African Americans made up around 10% of the membership. The American Federation of Labor was founded by Samuel Gompers in 1886 as a national organization of trade unions. Each trade union kept its independence. It remained the largest labor union until 1955, when it merged with the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Unskilled laborers were not permitted to join. Now, the South was trying during this time period to really recover from the Civil War and try to get its economy back together. And also during this time, you begin to have efforts to restrict the rights of the African Americans living in the South and attempts to disenfranchise them. And so you were going to have a lot of that that's going to happen in these last decades of the Gilded Age. Since the 15th Amendment made it impossible to disenfranchise African Americans as such, the purpose was accomplished indirectly with devices such as poll taxes and literacy tests. Since many claimed that these tests were also keeping poor whites from voting, loopholes were created. Mississippi inserted an understanding clause. The voter, if unable to read the Constitution, could qualify by being able to understand it to the satisfaction of the registrar. In 1898, Louisiana came up with the grandfather clause, which stated that voting tests would not apply to voters whose fathers or grandfathers were registered voters on January 1st, 1867, when no African American man in the state was registered to vote. Other states will adopt this clause as well. And when we come back the next time, we'll continue on with this discussion.